Now the presidential procession moves off, the ambulance leading the way. In the car behind are some other members of the official party. President Kennedy is on his route now, we believe, to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where his body will be prepared. After that, he will lie in state in the White House tomorrow. On Sunday, his remains at 12 noon will rest for 24 hours in the rotunda of the Capitol. And after that, the burial is expected on Monday or Tuesday. We still have had no firm word on that. Apparently, there has now been a change in plans. Most of the cars in the motorcade are making off. We still haven't seen any sign of President Johnson. However, James Rowley, the head of the Secret Service, remains on the scene, so quite possibly the new President of the United States is still here with us. We see Defense Secretary McNamara and George Ball, Under Secretary of State, now moving off to the side. Apparently, they are going to board helicopters for the trip to the White House and a special bipartisan meeting with President Johnson. Now President Johnson is coming down the ramp, out the back door, reserved for President, accompanied by Lady Bird, his wife.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
Those words from the new President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Words felt by all Americans. Now President Johnson goes over to confer, shake hands briefly with Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader in the House, with Senator Mike Mansfield, the Majority Leader, the Democratic Leader, in the Senate, Dirksen, of course, from the Senate, too. There's a huddle there as apparently the new President and his congressional leaders from both parties, his bipartisan group, confers to what happens next in this hectic, tragic day.
President Lyndon Johnson is flying by helicopter to the White House to assume his duties as Chief Executive of the United States. The late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, his body is being transported to Bethesda Naval Hospital for preparation for tomorrow's lying in state, where the body will be placed in the East Room of the White House for viewing by high government officials, members of the family. The public will not be admitted to tomorrow's viewing. There will be a public viewing as the President's body is placed traditionally in the rotunda of the Senate building in the Capitol, where it will lie in state from noon Sunday until Monday. Funeral services will be held in Boston. President Johnson, now flying to the White House, became president immediately upon the death of Mr. Kennedy, according to the provisions of the Constitution. He took the oath of office aboard the plane just before it took off from Dallas, his left hand on a Bible, and he swore to faithfully execute the duties of president and defend the Constitution. The oath was administered by U.S. District Judge Sarah T. Hughes, who thus became the first woman to swear in a chief executive. She was named to her post by Mr. Kennedy in October of 1961. President Johnson, as you heard, on his arrival a short while ago, issued a short, feeling statement. He said, "This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear." And then President Kennedy said, "I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask your help and God's." Late former President Harry Truman has commented on the tragedy this afternoon from his home in Independence, Missouri. He says he is shocked beyond words at the tragedy that has occurred to the country and to the President's family. The President's death, he said, is a great personal loss to the country and to him. Mr. Truman said, He was an able president, one the people loved and trusted. Mrs. Truman and I send our deepest sympathy to Mrs. Kennedy and the family. Mr. Truman said he plans to attend the funeral and burial services for Mr. Kennedy in Boston, but he does not believe he will be able to view the body in state tomorrow at the White House in Washington.
Alan, before President Johnson left the Senate, he made a comment which is worth quoting right now. What he said was this: "I am a free man, an American, a United States Senator, and a Democrat in that order. I am also a liberal, a conservative, a Texan, a taxpayer, a rancher, a businessman, a consumer, a parent, a voter, and not as young as I used to be or as old as I expect to be, and I am all those things in no fixed order." Those were the comments of Lyndon Johnson in another and happier time, in stark contrast with the simple, sad words which he uttered tonight at Andrews Air Force Base when he said, "This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed."
Associated Press White House correspondent Jack Bell was one of the eyewitnesses to this tragedy this afternoon. Bell was riding in the fourth car behind President Kennedy when the assassin struck. And Bell, in his dispatch for AP, said, "There was a loud bang, as though a giant firecracker had exploded in the caverns between the tall buildings we were just leaving behind us." In quick succession, there were two other loud reports. The ominous sound of these dismissed from the minds of us riding in the reporter's pool car the fleeting idea that some Texan was adding a bit of noise to the cheering welcome Dallas had given John F. Kennedy. The reports sounded like rifle shots, and suddenly the man in front of me, said Bell, screamed, "My God, they're shooting at the president." Our driver braked the car sharply, and we swung the doors open to leap out. Suddenly, the procession, which had halted, shot forward again. In the flash of that instant, a little tableau was enacted in front of a colonnade toward which the velvety green grass swelled upward to a small park near the top of an underpass for which we had been headed. A man was pushing a woman dressed in a bright orange to the ground, and he seemed to be plunging protectively over her. A photographer, scrambling on all fours toward the crest of the rise, held a lens camera trained in their direction. And Correspondent Bell says, "As my eyes swept the buildings to the right where the shots might have come, I saw no significant sign of activity." 4 cars ahead in the president's limousine, a man in the front seat rose for a moment, seemed to have a telephone in hand as he waved to a police cruiser ahead to go on. The presidential car leaped ahead, and those following it attained breakneck speed as the caravan roared through the underpass and on to a broad freeway, police sirens whining shrilly. These sirens had been silenced by presidential order throughout the Kennedy, Texas trip. Up to the highway thundered the caravan, careening through around a turn and screeching to a stop at the emergency entrance. As we piled out of our car, Bell said he saw Mrs. Kennedy, weeping, trying to hold her husband's head up. Mrs. John Connolly, the wife of the governor, was helping to hold up the head of her husband. That is part of the initial dispatch written by AP White House correspondent Jack Bell as he witnessed the tragedy from the fourth car in the cavalcade this afternoon.
Alan, one of the things that strike you when you consider the horrible events of the day is that it's possible that the president had the top of the bubble top car down in order to be better seen by the people. There was evidence the last time the president was in New York that he had ordered a relaxation of security restrictions. If you remember, when he came in from LaGuardia, he ordered that the Secret Service, not the New York Police Department, in fact, put on no special escort. And the president came in just as any other man might come in by automobile during the rush hour, stopped at traffic lights. The Secret Service were immensely alarmed because at one point, when he was stopped by a traffic light, a man came out on the street and took a picture of him at close range. So it seems possible that the president did order a relaxation of security restrictions in Dallas, and this may have been the reason that the bulletproof top of the limousine was not up, as it sometimes is. This is one of the most highly armored cars in the world, although it doesn't look it when you look at it. But the dome of the car is bulletproof. Unfortunately, the dome was not up.
As a matter of fact, Dallas, Jack Bell, in his piece, makes the point of that, and he, as the other reporters with the presidential party, have pointed out that the reception in Dallas was extremely warm. There was a large crowd of perhaps 250,000 people lining the streets, and Bell says that, ironically, if the presidential party reception in Texas had not been so warm, perhaps precautions might have been taken to raise that shatterproof side glass, even though the top of the convertible was down. And such a protection from the side glass might have saved the president, even if the bubble top wasn't up.
Yes, it's quite likely that that he was encouraged by the warm reception in Dallas to let the restrictions be a bit less rigid than they would have been otherwise. We have the latest now on the search for the assassin of the president. There's a story that's just come in from Mexico City, and it says that Mexico closed its borders with the United States today in an apparent effort to cooperate with U.S. officials in catching the assassin of President Kennedy. Informed sources in Mexico City are quoted as saying it's believed the assassin, who has still not been caught, might be heading for Mexico. First reports of the border closing came from Nuevo Laredo. They were followed shortly by reports from Matamoros, Reynosa, and Tijuana. The U.S. Embassy in Mexico City says it has not heard of any orders being issued by the United States government to close the frontiers. A disturbed reaction came from American tourists who are, at the moment, being prevented from returning across the border to the United States. Just when the borders will reopen probably will depend on how soon the assassin is captured. So goes that story from Mexico City, and it makes it fairly plain, if this story is correct, that the man named Lee Harvey Oswald of Fort Worth, who is in custody in Dallas tonight, is not the man who shot the president. It's not known at the moment whether Oswald will be charged with the fatal shooting of Dallas police officer Tippit, who was killed at almost the same time, as far as we know. Some of these reports are rather confusing, Alan, and
yes, they are, Dallas.
Which is natural, of course, in view of the consternation that resulted from the death of the president.
But it does seem extremely curious that, so far as we know, there have only been reports of 2 suspects being picked up, and one of them is this fellow Oswald, who is said to have killed a Dallas policeman in the same area, and another suspect said to have been picked up for questioning by police in Fort Worth, which, of course, is 20 miles away from Dallas. Here, more than 5 hours have passed now since the tragic event this afternoon, and we have had no further reports or information on the possible assassins or his possible apprehension. It begins to assume something of the incredible, that a president of the United States in this part of the 20th century can be assassinated, and so far, as we know, the assassin has not been apprehended.
Although the police did surround that building where the shots came from, they must have surrounded it within a very few minutes.
Yes, yes. It also, as we have mentioned earlier in our discussion of this, that it was obviously a carefully planned assassination, from the mere fact that the man had the telescopic gun, was an extremely accurate marksman, and according to one of the Dallas police officers who searched the area from which he shot, that is the 5th or 6th floor of that building, they had found remains of a lunch which he apparently brought along with him.
Yeah.
Had been waiting there for some time for the motorcade to pass. Here in New York, there is more reaction from the people on the street. Let's hear the story from news correspondent Bernard Eisman at Times Square.
The Great White Way dimmed its lights in honor of President Kennedy today. As evening approached, the giant advertising spectaculars at Light and Broadway flickered out. The movie houses closed their box offices and turned the bulbs out on their giant marquees, advertising classic and lurid pictures, but all in a welter of color that normally make this the brightest street in the world. The legitimate theaters in the side streets off Broadway, they too closed their box offices and doused the lights on their marquees. For the crowds along Broadway, usually jam-packed elbow to elbow and knee to knee on Friday and Saturday nights, this was a night of being stunned. There are very few people along the street, and those there are carry newspapers, talk silently one to the other, or stop and listen to radios or watch television sets in those few stores that are still open. At the hot dog stands, they too have dimmed their lights. The little radios go, and people cluster about, drinking a soft drink and listening to the details of this day of tragedy. Traffic along the street is very light. few cars are seen moving. The rush and honking of cabs is gone. In fact, in more than an hour on the street, a strange silence prevailed. Not the honk of a horn was heard, not the curse of a cab driver, not the squeal of a tire. Just quiet. And that's Broadway tonight. This is Bernard Eisman in Times Square.
Alan, we're still waiting for further word on the man named Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald is still being questioned by police in Dallas, Texas. Oswald is identified as having come from Fort Worth. He was arrested in connection with the slaying of the Dallas policeman shortly after the president was assassinated. Oswald was pulled from the Texas Theater in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas. We don't know exactly why he was arrested, except that apparently he worked in the same building in which the fatal shots were fired. Now, what other connection there is, we don't know. We're still waiting for further word from the scene. But apparently, Oswald is still being questioned, and after 2 hours of questioning, he denied any connection with the shootings. So that's the very latest on Lee Harvey Oswald.
In that latest story, which you have just told us about, is there any reference in there to the Dallas policeman who was killed? Is Oswald still being charged with that? He was originally, wasn't he?
He was arrested following, this story says he was arrested following the fatal shooting of a Dallas policeman. And the story says that they are now questioning him to see whether he knew anything about the president's death.
A great lack of information on the assassin and the possible suspects who have been picked up.
Well, Alan, we may have something a little bit later on that. A little bit more on the details of the events at the time of the shooting. At the scene of the ambush, Secret Service agents and police searched every building, and they soon came across the rifle in the school book depository building. That's the name of the five-story building where the assassin waited for the president. At about the same time, police got a telephone call from Mrs. Julie Postal, cashier at the Texas Theater in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas. She said she had spotted a man who, quote, looked like he was running from someone. He kept changing seats in the theater. Dallas policeman J.D. Tippett and M.N. McDonald rushed to the theater and ran into a rear exit. According to police headquarters, Tippett fired a shot. McDonald rushed the suspect, who turned out to be Oswald, and subdued him after a fight. Tippett was shot dead. Oswald admitted owning a snub-nosed .38 caliber pistol, which was used in the fatal shooting of policeman Tippett. Oswald did not admit owning the rifle found in the building near the scene of the assassination of the president. Asked whether fingerprints on the rifle matched those on the pistol, Police Detective Chief Will Fritz says, "I don't know." Police say Oswald and his wife have 2 children. His wife, a Russian, does not speak English. According to earlier information, Oswald married his wife while he was in the Soviet Union. He was there from 1959 to 1962, and apparently at one point defected to Russia, but then changed his mind and told the U.S. Embassy that he wanted to return to the United States. The Russians thereupon granted exit visas for Oswald, his wife, and according to this report, well, his family is either one child or 2. That's the very latest we have on Oswald. Apparently there is a very strong connection between the killing of Patrolman Tippett and the assassination of the president. But that connection has not been established yet by authorities who are continuing to question Oswald in Dallas, Texas.
It would certainly seem that there is a strong connection, Dallas, and this is the first information we have had on just how Dallas policeman Tippett was killed. Up until now, we have simply been told that he was killed nearby. Now we learn that he was killed by Oswald in the movie theater.
Right. The Tippett and another policeman, M.N. McDonald, went into the rear exit of the theater after getting that telephone call from the cashier. A Cuban living in New York has now described how a young man named Lee H. Oswald tried to infiltrate his anti-Castro organization. Oh, I beg your pardon. This report comes from New Orleans, not New York. Carlos Bringuier says that Oswald offered himself as a former Marine to train Cubans for an invasion. The man named Lee H. Oswald, age 24, has been arrested in connection with the slaying of a Dallas policeman shortly after the president was killed, and police are still questioning him about the Kennedy assassination. So far, Oswald has denied having any connection with the crime. Bringuier, the Cuban in New Orleans, says that he was suspicious of Oswald from the start. But frankly, he goes on, I thought he might be an agent from the FBI or the CIA trying to find out what we might be up to. And then a few days later, Bringuier goes on, I encountered him on Canal Street distributing Viva Fidel Castro literature. Bringuier says that anti-Castro Cubans, not uncommon in New Orleans, began to gather around Oswald. Bringuier says, we took all his propaganda away from him and broke up. And then the police came and arrested a lot of us, Oswald, myself, and some others. A few days later, Bringuier goes on in this report from New Orleans, we went into city court. The charges against all of us but Oswald were dismissed. He was convicted and paid a fine. Police reports, records in New Orleans show that an L.H. Oswald was convicted of disturbing the peace and was fined $10 last August. Bringuier has lived in New Orleans since February 1961. He operates a retail clothing store there. CBS News correspondent Hughes Rudd reports from Dallas, Texas, that the suspect, Lee Oswald, has just been let out of the police interrogation room and has been taken upstairs, presumably for booking. He has continued to deny any participation in the assassination of President Kennedy. It's not known at the moment whether he has been charged with the killing of Dallas policeman J.D. Tippit. The report that we had a few moments ago, which we read to you, would seem to indicate that Oswald must be intimately, closely connected with the killing of Tippit, because the cashier at the Texas Theater in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas says that she had spotted a man who looked like he was running from someone. He kept changing seats in the theater. This was just minutes after the president was assassinated. At that point, Dallas policeman J.D. Tippit and M.N. McDonald rushed to the theater and ran into a rear exit, and according to police headquarters, Tippit fired a shot, while McDonald rushed the suspect, who turned out to be Oswald, and subdued him after a fight. Tippit was shot dead. Oswald admitted owning a .38 caliber pistol, which was used, apparently, according to authorities, in the killing of Tippit. But Oswald has not admitted owning the rifle that was found in the building near the scene of the assassination. That's all we have at the moment on Oswald, but Hughes Rudd, as we said a moment ago, now tells us that Oswald has been taken out of the police interrogation room and has been taken upstairs, presumably for booking. Booking for what? Booking for what crime, we don't yet know. So far, he is still denying any participation in the assassination of President Kennedy.
Perhaps, Dallas, as the time goes along here, we will get more information on Oswald's connection with the assassination. Certainly all the circumstantial evidence appears to point in his direction. And from what we have learned from the biographical material from the wires and from Stu in Moscow and from this Cuban official in New Orleans, this apparently was quite a fanatical and incredible individual.
But of course, Alan, none of this jives with the report that we had from Mexico City about 40 minutes ago, to the effect that informed sources in Mexico City said it was believed that the assassin, still not caught, might be heading for Mexico. Perhaps they're talking about some other assassin or would-be assassin.
Yes, I recall that even before that came in, the brief announcement came in that the border between Mexico and the United States had been closed. Maybe this was just a precautionary effort just to cover all possible exits in case.
Alan, here's the latest on Oswald. The United Press International, in a report from Dallas, says Lee Harvey Oswald, a pro-Castro Marxist who once defected to Russia, today was jailed as the prime suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy. Oswald, a 24-year-old former U.S. Marine, was accused of shooting to death a policeman who tried to grab him in a theater just about the moment that President Kennedy was dying in Parkland Memorial Hospital. Another officer, McDonald, subdued Oswald, who lived in a Dallas rooming house with his Russian wife. It was the tip from the theater cashier that led police to him. The cashier, Mrs. Julie Postal, who works at the Texas Theater in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas, says she spotted a man who looked like he was running from someone. He kept changing seats in the theater. She had already heard of the shooting of President Kennedy and Governor Connolly, and she called police. Oswald has admitted owning the .38 caliber pistol, which was used to kill patrolman J.D. Tippit. Tippit was shot twice. Oswald has not admitted owning a rifle found in the building near the scene of the assassination of the president.
Dallas, we have a further note on that question about the Mexican border. Our news bureau in Los Angeles reports that the Mexican border, which had been closed, presumably to keep any fugitive from crossing into Mexico, has now been reopened on a restricted basis. Bona fide Mexicans in the United States are being allowed back into Mexico, and American citizens who were in Mexico are being allowed to cross the border to come back into the United States.
Alan, it may be too materialistic and crass to say it, but the New York Stock Exchange did register a $10.6 billion paper loss today. The exchange was stunned and thrown into chaos by the assassination of the president, and trading was closed shortly after 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Before that moment, the trading was running at one of the heaviest paces in history. A great flood of orders hit the exchange with the news that the president had been shot. The exchange was closed before he died. When the first news hit the exchange at 1:39 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the crowded floor of the exchange burst into consternation. Traders, brokers, bankers, runners, all were stunned and shocked. By 2:35, when the flash announced that the president was dead, the Board of Governors had closed the trading. Prices and market indicators all fell sharply. The Dow Jones indicator for industrial averages finished the day at 711.49. That was off more than 21 points, the sharpest drop since the panic selling of May 28, 1962. So the stock market took the president's death every bit as hard as the rest of the country.
We recall, too, Dallas, that the stock market took a similar dive when it was first announced that President Eisenhower had suffered a heart attack back in the 50s. And I believe the sell-off that day was even greater than it is now. And perhaps we'll have a further indication from this economic barometer of the feeling of the nation when business opens on Monday. We have one more reaction, one more expression of sympathy to the tragedy which has occurred, this time from James Farmer, the director of the Congress of Racial Equality.
Well, I think the president's family, the entire nation, and the whole world have suffered a grievous loss. We share Mrs. Kennedy's grief, and we believe that the death of the president is a direct result of his efforts in behalf of a better and more decent America for all its citizens. We rededicate our efforts to see to it that this dream of his becomes a living reality.
Here now is a message for our listeners and our affiliated stations across the country. The CBS radio network will supply continuous programming throughout this evening and until 12 midnight Eastern Standard Time. That is 11 o'clock Central, 10 o'clock Mountain, and 9 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. This programming will consist entirely of news broadcasts and appropriate music. We will provide similar network programming tomorrow and Sunday. At the close of tonight's programming, we will notify our affiliated stations in greater detail of our plans for the weekend. We will now have a 5-second pause for stations to identify themselves. This is the CBS Radio Network.
KRLD, AM and FM, Dallas. The following is a special report featuring Eddie Barker and Dallas Mayor Earl Cabell and the reaction of Dallas people to the assassination of President Kennedy.
Walter, I think that most Dallasites feel at this hour, as I do, still in a state of shock. But as the grim reality takes hold that in our town the President of the United States could be gunned down by a fiend, I shudder and feel sick in the pit of my stomach. And Dallas feels that way too. For as you know, Dallas is not that kind of town. To Easterners who come here, they often say, well, this is sort of a little New York. It's known as the town in the Southwest with the culture. It's had a lot of problems with its extreme elements, but this is something today that certainly has this town shocked. Mayor Earl Cabell, who was in that presidential parade today and was only a car's length away when the president was shot. Mayor?
Eddie, what you say about Dallas is true. Dallas has been proud, and it has been known as a friendly, as a gracious city. And that is what has added so much to the shock of what happened today. Along 12 or 14 miles of the route of the caravan, the parade, it was so obvious, the friendliness, the warmth, that was just coming from all of those people. Never in all of my life, and I've lived in Dallas all of my life, I've ridden in dozens of parades, but never have I seen such multitudes, such thousands on the street. And never have I seen such enthusiasm, such warmth that expressed themselves and that was so spontaneous as the cars passed. And then almost at the end of that route, for those shots to ring out, and with the realization as to what was going on, even before we realized what had actually happened. Eddie, the shock of it is just unbelievable. And it hadn't been 2 minutes prior to that we had been talking to Congressman Roberts of McKinney of this tremendous ovation that had greeted the president. And then, of course, the rest is history.
Mayor, we've had some bad light shed on this city of ours in the past few weeks. What with the incident here not too long ago when Adlai Stevenson was hit with a sign and spat upon, and now the president of the country is assassinated here. What is Dallas going to do?
Well, I cannot ascribe that to being the feeling of the true Dallas citizen or the preponderance of Dallas citizens. Those people represent only a handful of the radical right, and I don't ascribe criminal tendencies to them. Possibly they might have incited a lower grade of brain to have committed an act like this. But I can't point my finger. This is no time to point fingers. This is a time of prayer and sober reflection. We all have to search our souls with reference to what we might have said or done to have brought about a calamity of this sort.
Mayor, I would think that the feeling is that in the broad moral sense at least, that all of us share in what has happened here today, but this city, as you say, is not a city where things like this are done. The minority, it's a loud one, and today, this tragic thing that happens really once in a lifetime.
This is a guilt that doesn't belong to a few. This is a guilt of the nation. We're all responsible for this.
For the reaction of some Dallasites, here is CBS newsman Nelson Benton.
This is the corner of Elm and Eckerd Street in Dallas, Texas, late afternoon. And these are average citizens of Dallas, Texas. Could we ask your reaction to the president's death?
Well, we were just horrified when we heard that we couldn't believe that he had been shot. I heard we were working, and someone came in and told us that the president had been shot, and we just didn't believe him. That we didn't think that anything like that could happen.
Is this your wife?
Yes, it is.
May I ask you, what was your reaction?
I just couldn't believe it. I had only seen him just moments before, alive, and then...
You watched the parade?
Yes, I did. It was horrible.
How do you think the city of Dallas feels about it?
I think they think it's horrible.
Thank you very much.
Everyone I've talked to is just, they just can't believe anything like that's going to happen here.
The preceding was a special report featuring Eddie Barker and Dallas Mayor Earl Cabell and the reaction of Dallas people to the assassination of President Kennedy. This is Krld, AM and FM Dallas. We return now to the facilities of the CBS radio network.
Oswald was in New Orleans 2 months ago as the chairman of a pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba committee. He was reported to have been arrested for allegedly distributing pro-communist propaganda on a street corner. The House Committee on Un-American Activities says Oswald appears to be the same man who headed a Fair Play for Cuba committee in New Orleans. Police records there show that he did pay a $10 fine. This year, Oswald applied for another passport. He told the State Department he wanted to visit various countries in Western Europe and also Poland and the Soviet Union. He said he planned to make the trip between October 1963 and December or January of next year. The passport was issued at New Orleans on June 25th of this year. It's not clear whether Oswald ever repaid the money loaned for his passage back to the United States on his first trip, and obviously he did not use the newly issued passport. That's the story on Oswald as it begins to build up, as more details come in from Dallas, from New Orleans, and from Washington, as this man, this with a peculiar background, is still being questioned in Dallas, Texas, in connection with the fatal shooting of policeman J.D. Tippit, and perhaps also with the assassination of President Kennedy.
So we don't know whether it was the act of a madman or the act of a a left-wing political fanatic, or if it was, as Radio Moscow keeps insisting, the action of a right-wing fanatic. Radio Moscow has, of course, harped on the opposition to President Kennedy's foreign policy that has come to the surface in Dallas, or perhaps as much, if not more, than in many cities in the United States. It was only a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, on October 24th, that Adlai Stevenson, visiting Dallas on United Nations Day to make a speech on the United States and UN policy in that city, was spat upon and hit on the head by a woman carrying a sign objecting to America's UN policy and to him personally.
Dick, I was interested to note in the last report we had from Stuart Nowens in Moscow, the speed with which the Russians, in their accounts of President Kennedy's death, did pin it on right-wing extremists.
Well, I must say that the spontaneous reaction even of non-communists, of non-Russians at the United Nations this afternoon, when the word first circulated in the corridors, was that, based, of course, on Mr. Stevenson's experience in Dallas and on what one has heard from Dallas and the whole stamping grounds of right-wing elements like General Edwin Walker and others, the conclusion that was leaped to at the UN was that right-wing extremists might very well be responsible.
But I think we should point out, and we should emphasize, Dick, that at the moment there is absolutely no evidence at all to justify that assumption.
And when Mr. Stevenson came back from Dallas after his unfortunate experience there a month ago, he made it perfectly plain that he thought that the demonstration against him and against the United States, United Nations policy was not the expression of the popular will or the consensus of the public, but that it was merely the outburst of a few disgruntled individuals. And in fact, it was, I think, significant that the president, in his visit to Texas yesterday and today, and even his approach in Dallas, met only the most cordial kind of welcome. There were, of course, inevitably a few critics visible in the crowd, a few pickets carrying signs against Kennedy along the usual lines, but there was no indication at all that the perfectly respectable and perfectly permissible political opposition to the president and his policies would be translated in any way into this kind of senseless and murderous and violence.
No, as a matter of fact, the reception there was notably enthusiastic. As Alan Jackson and I were speculating a while ago, it may have been because of that fact, tragically enough, that the president might have ordered that the security restrictions be lifted somewhat, and for that reason the bubble top, the bulletproof bubble top on the presidential limousine was not in place.
Dallas, we have some news details now on the condition of Governor John Connally of Texas, who was seriously wounded today by apparently the same assassin who killed the president. He is now said to be in satisfactory condition at Parkland Hospital in Dallas after 4 hours of chest surgery. A team of 3 surgeons, including one rushed from Houston 250 miles away, removed one of the governor's ribs and repaired a lung that had been cut by a rifle bullet. The governor, it appears, turned slightly in the car as the shots were fired, and the chief of surgeons at the hospital said that it saved his life. If he had not turned, the bullet would have gone through the middle of his back and probably would have punctured the heart. As it was, a fragment struck Governor Connally's right wrist, fracturing it. Other fragments struck his left leg just above the knee and lodged there. The governor was conscious. He gasped to an aide, "Take care of Nellie," that is his wife, who was sitting next to him in the car, in the jump seat, just before the Kennedy couple. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, who flew back to Washington from Dallas with the body of her husband, then accompanied it in the Navy ambulance to Bethesda Naval Hospital, and she is there now. We'll get a report on the scene there at Bethesda Naval Hospital from Tony Sargent in Washington.
The body of President Kennedy is here at Bethesda Naval Hospital, just north of Washington. Hospital sources indicate a post-mortem examination is underway. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy accompanied the ambulance in the 45-minute drive from Andrews Air Force Base to Bethesda. On arrival, they entered the hospital's main entrance, while at least 1,000 spectators watched from the front lawn. Dozens more patients and hospital staff members peered from half-lighted windows in the 19-story building. The ambulance then left the main entrance, carrying the president's body around to a rear door near the morgue area in which the postmortem would be conducted. Minutes later, Defense Chief Robert McNamara arrived here after meeting with President Johnson. An Army officer with the presidential party indicated the body will go from Bethesda Naval Hospital later tonight to a funeral home. There, it presumably would be prepared to lie in repose tomorrow at the White House and through Sunday and Monday morning in the Capitol Rotunda. This is Tony Sargent at Bethesda Naval Hospital.
Krld News has Dick Wheeler on the line from the Dallas Police Department. Okay, Dick, if you're ready, go ahead.
Jerry, I'm reporting from the third floor of the City Hall on Commerce in Dallas. I'm down the hall from the office of Captain Will Fritz, the homicide captain. We have a bit of information more about the rifle used in today's, or believed to have been used in today's assassination of President Kennedy. This rifle is of a 6.5 millimeter size. We understand this is roughly equivalent to a what we know as a .30-30 caliber. The make of the rifle is not definitely known. There was no name on the weapon at all. However, it was believed to have been manufactured about 1940 in Italy. The rifle was a heavy weapon. It had a bolt action, type of action. It had a 4-power scope mounted on the top of the rifle, and we understand that there is, or was, one live round of ammunition found in the rifle when it was recovered from the 6th floor of the building from which the assassination was believed to have taken place. This weapon has not yet been definitely tied in with the suspect, who is being held now in jail here, and in Captain Fritz's office he is being taken back and forth. However, the weapon has not definitely been tied in with the suspect as yet. That word we thought we should bring you on the weapon, because of course it could be extremely important in the solving of this very heinous crime. There is one other word. Our district attorney, Henry Wade, about 5 minutes ago entered the office of Captain Will Fritz. We don't, of course, know why, but we do know that he did go in there a few minutes ago. We hope to bring you another report very shortly. This is Dick Wheeler, Krld News, reporting from the police station. We switch you now to the studio.
We've been talking about Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald's Russian wife, who does not speak English, according to this report, although another report says she speaks broken English, was brought to police headquarters in Dallas tonight and was questioned through interpreters. Oswald's wife lives in suburban Irving, Texas. Last October, he rented a box-like room for $8 a week from Mr. and Mrs. A.C. Johnson in Dallas. Mrs. R.C. Roberts, who works for the Johnsons, said that about 12:45 p.m. Central Standard Time today, she had just learned that Mr. Kennedy had been shot. Then she said, in rushed Oswald on the dead run. He ran to his room, came running back with a gray zipper jacket and out the door. I said, you sure are in a hurry, but he didn't even answer. Police later found a leather pistol holster and some books on communism and political magazines in his 8-by-15-foot room. As Oswald was returned at police headquarters in Dallas, was returned from the lineup, a reporter shouted, did you kill the president? Oswald replied in a loud voice, no, I did not kill the president. I did not kill anyone. However, Detective Homicide Lieutenant Captain Will Fritz says that he has been charged with the murder of policeman J.D. Tippett, who tried to arrest him in the Texas Theater in Dallas. The theater where Oswald was arrested is about 4 miles from the triple underpass where Mr. Kennedy was shot. Police Captain Will Fritz says that Oswald has been identified from a police lineup as the man who shot Patrolman Tippett. He says an eyewitness, presumably one in the theater, made the identification. But Oswald still denies that he killed anybody, either Tippett or the president.
KRLD AM and FM, Dallas.
From KRLD News, we interrupt the CBS continuing coverage for just a few moments while we have this special report from Parkland Hospital on the condition of Governor John Connally, who, too, was shot today. So we take you now to Lew Wood at Parkland Hospital.
Dr. Robert Shaw, the surgeon attending Governor John Connally, said tonight that the governor is feeling good. He is okay. is lucid and knows what happened. However, Dr. Shaw said, the information that President Kennedy has died has been withheld from the governor at least until tomorrow as a safety precaution. Governor Connolly was riding in the same automobile as the president when the assassin fired 3 shots into the car, wounding the governor and killing the president. Governor Connolly has gone to sleep for the night. His wife, Mrs. Connolly, has retired also in the room adjoining the governor's. This is Lou Wood reporting from Parkland Memorial Hospital. Now back to KRLD News.
This is KRLD News, and repeating some special announcements. All functions of the Eastern Star have been canceled for the entire weekend, and out of respect to the death of Mr. Kennedy, the Dallas Civic Opera has postponed their performance to tomorrow night at 8 p.m. And Sunday's performance had been changed from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. 3 football games scheduled in the Southwest Conference will be played tomorrow, but homecoming activities and other observances will be sharply curtailed in deference to the death of President Kennedy. Baylor and Southern Methodist will clash at Waco. This was to be carried, but has been canceled in the broadcast on KRLD. Rice and Texas Christian, meeting at Fort Worth, Arkansas, takes on Texas Tech at Fayetteville. There will be no special festivities celebrated, and there will be no broadcast tomorrow football games on KRLD. St. Michael's and All Angels Episcopal Church will have Requiem Mass at 11 a.m. tomorrow, Saturday, November the 23rd, for the deceased president. The church located at Douglas and Colgate. Now here is the weather forecast for Dallas, Fort Worth, and vicinity. Fair and colder tonight and Saturday, with a low tonight in the upper 30s, high Saturday in the lower 60s. Northwesterly winds 15 to 25 miles per hour tonight, becoming northerly 10 to 15 miles per hour on Saturday. Unofficial downtown temperature, while we await a new forecast, incidentally, at 9 o'clock, which will be presented as we have the opportunity. Unofficial temperature, Dallas now, 40 degrees. This is KRLD News.
We return now to the CBS radio network and Paul Niven and Dallas Townsend.
That he was in the building from which it's believed the president was shot. He says, I was there because I work in that building. And he claims, and this is a quote, they're holding me because I was in the Soviet Union. This is Nelson Benton at police headquarters in Dallas, Texas.
Here in New York, we have new information about the apprehension of Oswald in Dallas. At about the same time that the rifle used to kill President Kennedy was found in a Dallas office building, Patrolman J.D. Tippett stopped a man on the street about 4 miles from the scene of the assassination. Now, this report differs rather markedly from some of the reports we've given you earlier. The man on the street, later identified as Oswald, according to United Press International, drew a gun and shot Tippett. Then he fled as neighbors notified police. A few minutes later, the cashier of the Texas Theater, 5 blocks from where Patrolman Tippett had been killed, telephoned Dallas Police Headquarters that a man had run into the theater. His description matched that of Tippett's killer. 4 policemen were dispatched to the theater. The movie was in progress, but only a dozen or so people were there. An usher led Patrolman M.N. McDonald to where Oswald was sitting. The man jumped up, according to this account, and said, "This is it." He pulled out a snub-nosed revolver and tried to shoot McDonald, but the gun misfired. The 4 officers jumped on him. He fought wildly until they handcuffed him and dragged him to a car. That man is Lee Oswald. And as we said earlier, he has been charged with the murder of Patrolman J.D. Tippett, but he continues to deny it. And so far, there has been nothing official to connect him with the assassination of President Kennedy.
This is KRLD, AM and FM in Dallas.
This is Richard C. Hartelet of CBS News in New York. I'm at CBS Radio News headquarters with my colleague Dallas Townsend tonight on the night of the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. President Kennedy died on a trip. He left Washington and flew to Texas yesterday for a trip that combined national and political purposes. He received in Texas, wouldn't you say, Dallas, a reception which makes it all the more unbelievable that it should have ended at 12:30 this afternoon the way it did.
All the reports that we had from Texas around the state were that his reception was extremely enthusiastic, and in fact it seemed to be getting more enthusiastic as the trip progressed. there was a certain amount of coolness when the president arrived at San Antonio yesterday. That was ascribed almost entirely to a split inside the Democratic Party in Texas, a split between the rather conservative Governor John Connally and the liberal Democratic Senator Ralph Yarborough. President Kennedy made a point of bringing Senator Yarborough to Texas with him on the presidential plane, and while they were en route, Senator Yarborough had some rather harsh things to say about Governor Connally, things which I'm sure have been long since forgotten in the rush of today's murderous and tragic events. The governor was badly injured, but not critically injured. He is tonight reported doing fairly well in Parkland Memorial Hospital. In any case, the trip did begin on a non-political note. The president went to San Antonio to dedicate the Aerospace Medical Center. That was a decidedly non-political speech. The president said, for example, "We have tossed our cap over the wall of space. We have no choice but to follow it." It was a reply, in a sense, to his critics in both parties, both Democratic and Republican, who had attacked his decision to go ahead with the Man to the Moon program. From then on, the president's trip assumed a rather political hue, and of course it was important to him. It was important as evidenced by the fact that he took Mrs. Kennedy with him. It was her first public appearance of any extent since the tragic loss of their baby during the summer. And Mrs. Kennedy went with the president. It was a political trip in the sense that he hoped to patch up the wounds in the Democratic Party structure in Texas and to increase his own chances for winning Texas in 1964. In 1960, you remember, he won the state by only 43,000 votes.
The trip to Texas was prefaced by a sort of trial or pilot trip to Florida a week ago. President Kennedy, obviously going down to a South which was severely aggrieved by his dynamic and forceful civil rights policy, had met a most warm welcome in Florida.
Warmer than some Republicans had expected, and in fact the warmth of the welcome he received in Florida gave some Republicans who up until now had been supporting Senator Goldwater, gave them pause in a sense. Perhaps they felt that Senator Goldwater might not do as well in the South next year against President Kennedy campaigning for re-election as they had expected. In any case, the president's welcome in Florida was a warm one, and the welcome he was receiving in Texas was, by all accounts, even warmer.
The burden of his talk, his last talk in Fort Worth this morning, was also a subject, and it struck a note which must have been very welcome in the place in which it was struck. At Fort Worth, where the great Convair factory is designing the new F-111, the famous Jfk'S, Mr. Kennedy spoke of American strength, and he underlined the need for the United States to be strong.
This was when the presidential motorcade was on its way to the Dallas Trade Fair, where the president was to make a speech, the text of which had actually been released, but the speech the president never made. It was so ironic. As a matter of fact, everybody has been pointing out today how loaded with irony and tragedy this day has been. The Secret Service had made the most minute preparations to check on the safety of the president along the way. They had checked, as always, the food he would eat, the flowers he would sniff, the roads he would travel, and the buildings he would enter. But as Huey Bauman, the former head of the Secret Service, the head of the Secret Service has said, it's absolutely impossible to check every single building. And this building was the one where the assassin was waiting for the president.
And there again, all the antecedents built up to this moment of tragedy because the president had been welcomed so warmly in Florida, because on his last trip to New York he had chosen to dispense with much of the fol-de-rol of a presidential procession.
Dispense with the police motorcade.
The sirens. There were no sirens even in Texas. Because of all this, a sense of confidence, a sense of belonging to and with his people, a sense of the contact between the happy, welcoming crowds and himself, he probably, one doesn't know,
probably caused or led to or encouraged the relaxation of some of these extraordinarily tight security precautions that are made. The bulletproof glass windows of his limousine were rolled down. It was very warm. The bubble top was off, possibly because of the heat, more likely because the president felt that he would want to stand in his car whenever he chose to respond more visibly to the ovation along the way. But there at this instant, as they approached an underpass down in the center of Dallas, their 3 shots rang out. William Greer, the regular Secret Service driver, was at the wheel. The president was seated in the rear of his car. To the right, his wife was on his left. The governor of Texas, Governor Connolly, John Connolly, who had been his Secretary of the Navy, was in one of the jump seats immediately in front of the president, and Mrs. Connolly was on his left. A man, an eyewitness, who was 15 feet away from the president, said the president was smiling, gesticulating, and suddenly a terrible look came over his face, and the man became aware of the shot. The president was struck by the first shot. Incidentally, it must have been the diabolical work of a consummate marksman, because the motorcade was moving 25 to 35 miles an hour. Although the course had been well advertised and the people were there was no mystery about the time and place, still and all, this man apparently didn't fire what was a superfluous shot.
Apparently not. And as the police have reconstructed it, it appears that the shots were fired after the car had passed the warehouse, this book warehouse. It was fired from behind, and since the bulletproof windows, the bulletproof glass was not in place, the bullets struck their target.
The president, as we said, was struck by the first shot. Governor Connolly heard the crack of the rifle and turned slightly in his jump seat toward the president, who sat immediately behind him. And at that instant, he too was shot. Whether he was shot deliberately for himself, or whether this was just an action of the motion of the marksman following the line of the car along, of course, we may never know. But Governor Connolly was shot as well. The Secret Service man up front grabbed the telephone in the car and at once ordered the police leading the motorcade to speed as fast as they could to the nearest hospital. And
Parkland
they
Memorial
roared
Hospital.
off to the hospital.
At very high speed.
At very high speed. President Kennedy was apparently still alive. A bullet must have entered the back of his head and gone down and emerged from just below his throat. He was still alive. Of course, he was he was unconscious, and he at once.
His wife cradled her head in his hands on the way to the hospital. When the car arrived at the hospital, the president was unconscious. He was slumped over in the seat. He was brought by stretcher to the operating room while the doctors tried desperately to save his life. There was a frantic half hour or so, and then it was all over. The doctors said afterwards, some of them, that there was no hope at all that the president could have survived.
Meanwhile, of course,
the vice president.
The vice president
was 3 cars back.
3 cars back, unhurt, happily, because one of the prime rules of security is that the president and the vice president of the United States never travel in the same conveyance. They never fly in the same airplane, the same helicopter, and in motorcades. They obviously not only do not ride in the same car, but they follow far enough behind so that, let us say, an explosion which might destroy one car would not damage the other. But of course, with the shots fired, there seemed to have been 3. One doesn't still know how many shots struck the president. It is presumed to have been 1. It is presumed that 1 shot struck the governor. There is talk of 3 shots. Well, we don't know. But at once, a massive manhunt was set in motion. The shots seemed to come from some kind of warehouse or book repository within easy sight of the scene of the crime. There was also a park. Secret Service men rushed up looking for a sniper who might have been hidden in ambush among the foliage. There was nothing there. We've set up a line with our correspondent in Dallas, Texas, our CBS News correspondent, Dan Rather, and we might very profitably talk to him to ask him what the effect of this assassination was on Dallas, whether there is in Dallas any sound theory of how this came about or what may underlie it politically or socially. Dan Rather, are you at the other end of the line?
Yes, Dick. Good evening.
Good evening to you. Dan, what is the mood and the spirit in Dallas tonight?
Dick, the mood in Dallas is still one of very deep shock. There are many people in Dallas who sincerely and literally still have a very difficult time believing what happened here today. Right after the word came that the president had been sped to a hospital, switchboards all over town, at the police station, at television stations, radio stations, newspapers, were simply flooded with calls. Almost all of them saying, it isn't so, is it, that the president has been shot? Then when the official announcement was made that the president not only had been shot but was dead, you could feel it. You walked downtown and the streets were suddenly practically empty. Just an hour or so before, they had been filled with people who had poured out an extremely warm greeting for President Kennedy and for Mrs. Kennedy. Dallas was very anxious to make up for what it felt were some hours of shame during the recent visit of United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, during the days of the 1960 campaign, when it was felt that whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, that Vice President Lyndon Johnson had been mistreated in a hotel lobby by what some called extreme right-wing elements. Dallas was all out today to make amends for some of those things of which the city's leaders were ashamed. Up until the time the 3 shots rang out, this had been what native Dallasites were freely calling probably the biggest turnout for any president since possibly the days of Franklin Roosevelt. It was called by President Kennedy himself, by several witnesses, one of whom was Mrs. John Connally, the wife of the Texas governor, who was also injured. Many witnesses said that President Kennedy had said, both at the Dallas airport and during the long, slow motorcade winding through the downtown area, that this was by far the warmest reception he had received in Texas, that is, until the shots were fired. Tonight, there isn't much activity on the streets. Normally, Dallas is a rather sophisticated nightlife town. There isn't much of that going on tonight. No final decision has been made, but officials of Texas Christian University and Rice University are considering, and I underline considering, cancellation of tomorrow's scheduled Southwest Conference football game. The same type of consideration is going on between officials of Southern Methodist University and Baylor. And this time of year, football is very big down in this part of the country, but there are some strong indications that all of the football games scheduled for tomorrow may be canceled. Officials of the universities are now conferring on that. The city is in a deep state of shock, and I think it's safe to say that over the next several days, you're going to see some outward manifestations of extremely deep soul-searching on the part of not only Dallasites, but all of Texas. This is something, it may be Texas' darkest hour ever.
Dan, there is a report circulating now that a charge will be filed before midnight, your time, in connection with the president's death. Do you have anything on that?
Ever since the man Oswald was arrested this afternoon, approximately 2.5 hours after the president's death was announced, there have been varying reports that charges were imminent concerning the president's death. We also have heard the report that charges may be filed before midnight. The only fact that we can point to is that a justice of the peace that has been standing by at police headquarters for the last 6 hours on the possibility that some charges may be filed is still there. And it is possible that some charges will be filed before midnight our time. That would be 1 o'clock on the East Coast. But other than the fact that a justice of the peace is standing by with charges prepared, ready to be filed, there is nothing else in the way of solid evidence to indicate that might be so.
What can you say, Dan, about the physical appearance, the conduct of Oswald? Have you seen him personally?
Yes, I have, Dallas. He's a short, slight man. He is 5 feet 9 inches tall, according to the police, and he actually appears to be a little shorter than that. He's almost jockey size. He weighs about 145 to 60 pounds. Dark hair, a receding hairline at the edges, hawk-nosed, a very intense man. He was literally arrogant when brought into the police station for questioning. He has shouted at newsmen a number of times when he has been in their presence. The last couple of times that he has been in sight and earshot of newsmen, he has screamed out, "I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I am not represented by counsel, this is not fair." Other than that, the background on Oswald locally, he lived in a suburb of Dallas, and by the way, there's some dispute over exactly which suburb he lived in. Police say that he was a resident of Irving, which is a rapidly growing suburb outside Dallas, but the mayor of Irving called the local radio and television stations not too many minutes ago, we're told, saying that he had established Oswald was not a resident of Irving, that he was a resident of Oak Cliff, which is still another suburban area of Dallas. But at any rate, he did live in a suburban area of the city. He lived in an apartment. The lady from whom he rents the apartment says that Oswald was an avid reader of cowboy books. She also says that he has been rather quiet the past few days. His wife is a Russian-speaking woman. She speaks only limited English. And that's about the book on Oswald as we've been able to observe and gather from police.
Mm-hmm. Dan, it's perhaps significant, or is it, that the theater where he was captured is in Oak Cliff?
It very well might be. I think what you're pointing to is it's possible that Oswald was trying to get back to his home. It may be significant that the Texas Theater is located in Oak Cliff. We'll simply have to wait and see.
Oh, could you tell us something, Dan, about his being booked on charges of shooting and killing Patrolman Tippett? Is that definite? Has he been booked on that charge?
That is definite. He has been booked on that charge, and at the moment that is the only charge on which he has been booked. Police say they have very strong evidence, including at least one eyeball witness to the shooting of that police officer, which, by the way, did not occur in the theater. There have been conflicting reports on exactly where that killing of the police officer occurred. It was not in the theater. Oswald reportedly, allegedly, tried to shoot a policeman inside the theater as police closed in on him. We're told by police that he aimed a pistol at an officer and the pistol had a misfire as he aimed it at the officer. But Officer Tippett was not killed inside the theater.
Dan, you said a moment ago that Oswald protests that he has no counsel. Is counsel being supplied? Do you know anything about that? Has he called a lawyer?
I don't know. Police aren't saying. They obviously, and I think perhaps understandably, are not saying much at this stage. Now, of course, the law is very clear that in practice in Texas, from many years of reporting on the police beat in this area, the practice in Texas generally is that a suspect in any case is given an opportunity to call counsel within 2 hours after his arrest. It's not a hard and fast rule. There have been various interpretations by the courts on how soon a person should be allowed to call his counsel. So far as I know, Oswald has not contacted counsel. Whether or not he's been given an opportunity to contact anyone or not, I can't say.
Has he seen his wife?
I don't believe he has seen his wife.
I understand that his wife has been questioned by police.
His wife has been questioned by police.
Has she been able to shed any further light on this? Do you know?
Well, the police haven't told us what she said other than to say that she does not speak good English. I gather the impression that they're having a hard time getting anything out of her simply because they have a difficult time understanding her.
Dan, it's too early to certainly to proclaim guilt or innocence, and it may be that this man, this suspect, is incidental. Is there any reasonable speculation in Dallas tonight as to the motive of this crime? Is there anything that led up to it that might shed some light on the circumstance?
Well, Dick, Dallas has a long history, at least a 20-year history, of a building conservative movement in the city. You and Dallas discussed this earlier, I believe. As you know, former Major General Edwin Walker lives here in town. H.L. Hunt, the famed Texas millionaire who has been associated with conservative movements, lives here. There have been a number of nationally prominent, strongly conservative movements headquartered in Dallas. And there are some people, of course, who are trying to make some connection. But I think it's far too early for that. And most of the Dallasites with whom I've spoken are hoping, at least, and I think most of them believe, that this was the work of a madman who was an excellent shot.
And, Dan, I think it might also be pointed out that none of that history of right-wing strength in Dallas jives with what we know of the background of Oswald, who appears to be rather on the other side of the political spectrum.
It certainly does not
be located
jive.
anywhere.
That's a point well taken. Oswald, as I think you pointed out earlier, was arrested in New Orleans for handing out pro-Castro propaganda, as I understand it. And he certainly, from all we can gather, was on the direct opposite end of the political spectrum from the strongly conservative movements with which Dallas has been associated in recent years.
Dan, did these strongly conservative movements show any growing trend toward action? What I have in mind is that in so many of the violent incidents of recent months and years, the perpetrators have perhaps been encouraged by the condoning of violence by people in authority, politically and otherwise, and have perhaps felt themselves justified in having recourse to extreme, to savage, to criminal methods in terms of dynamitings and shootings and the rest. Has there been anything building up in Dallas which might perhaps provide a psychological foundation for this kind of action?
Before today, Dick, I would say quite the opposite. I think there was perhaps a building feeling among some of these very extreme right-wingists in Dallas, say 2 years ago, toward lashing out in perhaps frustration, nonetheless moving toward violence of some kind, perhaps not desperate violence, but taking action, let us say. But the Oxford, Mississippi affair sobered up an awful lot of people in this whole part of the country, and the Birmingham school bombing seemed to be having the effect of quietening down the action elements. But in light of today, if any connection is ever made between some of the persons and groups who have been called ultra-rightists and what happened here today, then you would have to say that the action elements have indeed been moving toward more action and more violence. But let me emphasize that I don't think that any direct connection will ever be established.
You said earlier, Dan, that there's a great deal of soul.
Now to the KRLD newsroom and Eddie Barker.
From the KRLD newsroom, we've had a lot of calls tonight pertaining to the SMU Baylor game that was scheduled for Waco tomorrow afternoon. We've just been informed by SMU athletic officials the SMU Baylor game has definitely been postponed. Tentatively, it will be played on December the 7th. However, that is not official, but it will not be played tomorrow. SMU Baylor officially postponed tomorrow. There will be no ball game in Waco between SMU and Baylor tomorrow. Now back to the CBS network.
From a distance, and some of them perhaps found a little funny, a man being perhaps hit by a picket or some lady spitting upon someone else. Now suddenly there seems to be a dawning and a lot of sobering of people who took no interest in this kind of thing or gave it only a passing glance or perhaps laughed at it in the past, saying to themselves, this is and has been for some time very serious business in Dallas. It's that kind of soul-searching that I believe is going on now.
Yeah. Will there be any political repercussions if the president had been on a frankly political fence-mending tour to mend a rather split, shattered Democratic Party? Will this serve to unify it again?
I would think so, certainly. I think that when President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson started out on this Texas trip, that there was a very good chance would not go in the Democratic column in the 1964 elections. That view was shared by many longtime political observers in the state. In light of what happened today, the Democrats probably will carry the state overwhelmingly. Now, that, of course, is an opinion, and it's a long time before election time. But my guess is that what happened here today will certainly unify and solidify the Democratic Party in Texas. And a unified, solidified group of Democrats are very difficult to beat in this section of the country and in Texas in particular.
Dan, can we go back for just a moment to the frantic events immediately following the assassination? We had initial reports that police surrounded that 5 or 6 story building, the book repository building, where the assassin waited for the motorcade. Is that correct? And if so, was anybody else arrested, do you know? Or was anybody else in the building, as a matter of fact?
Whether there was anyone else in the building or not has not been fully established. My feeling is that there wasn't anyone else in the building at that particular time. That's a feeling based on a number of conversations with police.
Yes.
Police ringed the building within minutes after the shooting. I would say within 15 minutes at the longest, and I'm inclined to think it was less than that. They ringed the building completely, and then they established a ring around about a 5 or 6 block area on all sides of the building. Within 45 minutes after the president was shot,
but that still would have
inch, foot by foot, search of the building was underway.
But that still would have given the assassin time to make his getaway, would it not?
It certainly would have.
I see that Captain Fritz of the Homicide Department now says it has been established that Oswald was in the building at the time the shot was fired, and police are understood to be making paraffin tests on Oswald's hands for marks of gunpowder.
I have not heard that report. I can check it very quickly with Nelson Benton, a CBS newsman who is standing by at the police station while we participate in this broadcast. I would say that if police have definitely established that Oswald was in the building at the time of the shooting, on the basis of what they've been saying all evening long, that this increases the probability or the possibility of charges being filed in a short while.
Yes, you mean assassination charge?
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
The charges have been filed, of course, in the case of the killing of the policeman.
What would you say, from your knowledge of the man and of the environment, as to what we might expect in the new President of the United States?
Lyndon Johnson's roots are in the agricultural area. He is basically a country boy. That may be taken in some quarters as rather disrespectful of the new President of the United States, and I do not intend it to be so, but he is basically a country man. He takes great pride in the LBJ Ranch, to which he had hoped to take President and Mrs. Kennedy on a visit this very night. He put himself through college, Southwest Texas State Teachers College, which is not far from where he was born, in the Austin area of Texas, in the central part of the state. He taught school in Houston for a while after graduation, but took an immediate and deep interest in politics. Sam Rayburn probably was the greatest influence on Lyndon Johnson's life and his professional career. Outside of Mr. Sam, I would say probably John Nance Garner, who, by the way, today celebrated his 95th birthday. Mr. Garner came from the same general section of the state and the same rough background from which Lyndon Johnson came, and the new president consulted often with John Nance Garner in the former vice president's years when he was able to be a bit more alert and a bit more active than he is now. I'm speaking, of course, of Garner. Johnson is considered by those who know him best in this state as the complete politician. That is, he is well-grounded in legislative processes. There are those who say no person knows the inner workings of the government of the United States domestically any better than Lyndon Johnson. There are many of those same people who feel that his weakness, if he has one, has been in the field of foreign affairs. And I think it perhaps significant to note that in recent years, Mr. Johnson has been trying to change that image. As you know, he's traveled greatly as vice president of this country. He has been alternately very popular and very unpopular in the state. He was elected to the Senate of the United States by the very close margin of only 87 votes in an election that is to this day debated and a subject of great controversy in the state. He was trailing in that election up until the time the last boxes came in, and he won it by only the 87 vote margin. I think Johnson's popularity reached its peak in Texas in the mid-1950s when he began to be known not only in this state but all over the nation as an outstanding Senate Majority Leader. His popularity began to wane in the state in the late 1950s. In the 1960 election campaign, there were some in the state who felt that Johnson's place on the ticket was about as much a liability to Mr. Kennedy as it was an asset. Since taking over as vice president, Mr. Johnson's popularity returned somewhat, and even though there were many who felt before today that the Kennedy-Johnson ticket, if it turned out to be that, would have a tough time carrying Texas in 1964, I think it was the consensus of opinion that Lyndon Johnson was more popular in Texas now than he had been at any time since the mid-1950s.
Dan, what does he believe in? What makes him tick?
His history is one of being at heart a liberal in the sense that we normally think of a liberal politician. He got into politics in the days of the early Roosevelt years and the New Deal. You read back over some of his old speeches and some of his the old quotes in newspapers. And Lyndon Johnson, in the years before the war and even immediately after the war, was certainly for this part of the country, and I suspect for any section of the country, pretty much a liberal. But in recent years, he had tried to cast himself, a picture of himself, more as that of a moderate, because the tenor of politics in the state of Texas consistently moved more toward the conservative side.
Dan, let's get back for just a moment to the enigmatic and peculiar Mr. Oswald. On the basis of your years as a police reporter in Texas, what is likely to happen now? What will happen? What's the procedure that will be followed now that he has been charged with the killing of Patrolman Tippett?
Well, first of all, let's point out that there is no federal law against the killing of the President of the United States. At least the local attorneys who were around the police station pointed this out, that what has been violated is the law against murder in the state of Texas, which means that if any charges are filed against anyone, that person will be tried in the state of Texas. Now, he will be charged at the police station by Justice of the Peace, which is at the very lower end of the court spectrum in the state. After and if charges are filed before Justice of the Peace, the man charged is entitled to a quick pretrial hearing if he is indicted. Immediately after the charges are filed, then he will be given an opportunity to make bond. That is, if a judge can be convinced that an opportunity to release the man on bond should be granted. It's possible that a judge would say, in this case, and under Texas law this can be done, in this case, I don't believe it's safe to let the man out, either for his safety or the safety of other people. And he could refuse, a judge could refuse to set bond. However, it would be normal for a bond to be set, even in a case like this. A defense attorney would make a plea to allow the man to be released on bond. The bond might be set so high that the person would not be released. But let us say that immediately after charges are filed, the man is brought before a magistrate, a judge, and makes a plea for bond. The judge refuses the bond. I would say, on the basis of my experience and in light of the case, it's highly probable that the judge would not allow the person accused of the assassination of the President of the United States to be released on bond.
I would say that's a safe assumption.
The man then would be taken to the county jail here in Dallas County and would await a possible indictment by a county grand jury. Granted that he was indicted by the grand jury, there then would be a pretrial consultation between the prosecution attorneys and the prosecution for the defense. If the man was not able to hire his own counsel, counsel would be provided by the state of Texas.
How long would all this process take, Dan? Weeks, a month or so, or what?
I would say more probably in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 months. I would point out that it's not necessarily so that the man would be tried in this county. His defense attorneys, of course, could ask for a change of venue and could
on grounds that he couldn't get a fair trial in Dallas.
That's right. But if a change of venue were granted, the trial would have to be held somewhere in the state of Texas.
So, you think that within 2 or 3 months, he might come to trial before a jury?
It could be less than that, but considering the case and the normal procedures, I would say 2 or 3 months, probably around the first of the year.
Dan, we've all heard in the last 3 years or so much about the Kennedy compound at Hyannisport, the home to which the president liked to go so much. He always liked to go back to Cape Cod, if not to the family home, to another home nearby. And we're now probably going to hear a great deal about the Johnson Ranch. I believe you've been there. I wonder if you could give us a little eyewitness picture of it.
Oh, happily, Dallas. For whatever else you say or think about Lyndon Johnson, he has a beautiful home. His home is just west of Austin in the central part of the state. It is in the hill country of the beginnings of West Texas. It runs by the Pedernales River, which is a small river which flows rather rapidly. The spread is flat land in that particular area. The house is a frame house, a rather old house, but beautiful in that it stands in a Texas colonial architectural style. Some of our architect friends will probably give us a hard time about that description, but it has a little bit of the old South colonial look to it, but at the same time has a Western look in the architecture of the home. Has a swimming pool in the front yard. Just behind the house, there are some servants' quarters, And immediately behind the house, there are fields of various crops. The last time I was on the Johnson Ranch, which I believe was last spring, at any rate, just behind the house, a cotton field, and within view of the back door, considerable grazing land for cattle. I think the place will probably be considerably enlarged now that it will serve as the compound, as you put it, for the weekend retreats of the new president.
What about the family flag that always flies over the home when he's there?
Well, I think the family flag will continue to fly. They have a flagpole right in front of the home. It has, for as long as I can remember, and I suspect for as long as Lyndon Johnson can remember, it has flown a flag that at one time flew over the capital of the United States. It hasn't always been the same flag. As one flag would wear out, another replaced it, but always a flag that at one time or another had flown over the capital.
What is the nearest town, Dan, to the Johnson Ranch?
Johnson City, Texas, is the closest town of any size.
How far away is that?
About 14 miles, perhaps a little bit less than that.
So we can assume that the Secret Service and the White House press corps may be a little bit cramped for space when they cover the president on his weekends in Texas.
I would say that you probably will see the greatest motel building boom in history going on in the Johnson City LBJ Ranch area very soon. There are practically no facilities for handling outsiders except in the homes of private individuals in that area right now.
Yes, and as we know, when the president moves, a great many other people move right along with him. And they'll have to do that in this case also.
The closest town where there are sizable accommodations now is Austin, which is a good 2-hour drive away.
Well, Dan, is there anything more that you think should be said this evening after this tragic day in Dallas, with its consequences for the state, for the nation, and for the world?
Dick, I think it may be said that, and this may be a prejudiced viewpoint, for as some of our listeners may know, this correspondent was born and raised in Texas, but Texans are sensitive people. It was unfortunate that this had to occur in Dallas because of Dallas's reputation in recent years of being rude to visitors from the outside. Whether the reputation was justifiable or not might be debatable, but the reputation stood nonetheless. Had it occurred any place else in Texas outside of Dallas, Texans could write it off in their own minds and in their hearts as just one of those things, and it just happened to happen here. But because it happened in Dallas, for at least a while, and at least until the facts are known as to who did it and why, Texans are going to be asking themselves, why did it have to be in Dallas?
Dan Rather, thank you very much for your eloquent and incisive report. This is Richard C. Hottelet and Dallas Townsend at CBS News headquarters in New York, and we will pause now for 5 seconds for stations along the line to identify themselves. This is the CBS Radio Network.
This is Krld, AM and FM in Dallas.
As the night goes on, the night after President Kennedy's tragic death, of course, all activity begins to focus on Washington, and there's a dispatch in now from Honolulu that 6 members of President Kennedy's cabinet, headed by Secretary of State Rusk, are on their way back toward Washington. They had left Hickam Air Force Base bound for Tokyo this morning. They were going to have a 3-day United States-Japanese conference there, but when they got the word in midair on their way between Honolulu and Tokyo, they ordered the plane turned around. Now, after a brief refueling stop back from Honolulu, the plane took off again some hours ago for the 8-hour and 10-minute flight to Washington. The plane, with the Secretary of State aboard and a number of the other cabinet members, is due to land in Washington in just about 45 minutes from now. In Honolulu, Robert Manning, the Deputy Secretary of State for Public Affairs, made a statement for the 6 cabinet members saying that they were shocked at the grievous tragedy that had befallen the country.
Dick, some of our stations have had queries from listeners as to the display of the flag. That is, during the period of mourning. The proper display of the flag was the subject of an act of Congress in 1942. That act carries no penalties, so it is in effect a recommendation only insofar as civilians and unofficial groups are concerned. However, government buildings and military installations of the United States in this country and around the world will fly the flag at half-staff for 30 days. This is under a proclamation issued by President Eisenhower in 1954. That proclamation specified that the flag should stay at half-staff or half-mast for 30 days upon the death of the president or a former president. As we move toward the end of our extended coverage of this national catastrophe, I think it might be well, for the benefit of our listeners who perhaps have joined us late, to go back and recapitulate briefly the events of this day. As far as the president was concerned, in public, they began at 8:50 a.m. Central Standard Time, when the president came out of the Texas Hotel, and this was in Fort Worth, came out of the Texas Hotel in Fort Worth and addressed a friendly crowd of about 5,000 persons in a parking lot across the street. At 8:55 a.m., he walked back into the hotel. At 9 a.m., he arrived at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast. Mrs. Kennedy joined him a bit later. The president remarked humorously that it took her a bit longer to get organized. At 10:30 a.m. Central Standard Time, the presidential party left the Texas Hotel in Fort Worth, and at 11:10 a.m. they arrived at Carswell Air Force Base. At 11:25 a.m., they left Carswell Air Force Base by plane for the short trip to Love Field in Dallas. At 11:35 a.m., they arrived at Love Field, and there was a crowd of about 2,500 persons there waiting for them. The president's motorcade, in fact, was delayed so that he could shake hands with greeters at the airport. At 11:50 a.m., the presidential motorcade left Love Field. At 12:16 p.m., this is still Central Standard Time, the motorcade reached the outer edge of the downtown area of Dallas. At 12:25 p.m., the motorcade passed through the heart of the downtown area. At 12:29, the motorcade went from downtown toward the Dallas Trade Mart, site of the luncheon at which the president was to speak. At 12:31 p.m., according to this revised timetable of today's events, at 12:31 p.m., the president and Governor John Connally of Texas were shot. The motorcade immediately speeded up and went as fast as possible to the Parkland Memorial Hospital. At 12:40 p.m., a staff surgeon and a neurosurgeon performed a throat operation and applied breathing stimulants to the president. But the operation was a failure. It could never have been a success, apparently, in view of the wounds the president suffered. The bullet had hit the back of his head, had blown out a large part of the back of his head, and the breathing stimulants could not work either. At 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, the president died. At 2:07 p.m., a bronze casket containing the body of the president, and that casket was accompanied by Mrs. Kennedy, left Parkland Hospital for Love Field. At 2:27, Mrs. Kennedy boarded Air Force One, the presidential plane, accompanied by the coffin. At 2:39 p.m., also on board the presidential plane, Vice President Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office as president from U.S. District Judge Sarah T. Hughes. At 2:47, the plane was airborne for Washington. And now, for the latest at the White House, we will switch to the White House and Stephen Banker.
Sometime during the night, the body of President Kennedy will be brought to the White House to be prepared to lie in repose tomorrow. When the hearse arrives from Bethesda Naval Hospital, representatives of all the military services will line the White House drive, the lobby, and the hallway to the East Room. There, his body will be placed on a catafalque, a temporary resting place similar to that used for the body of Abraham Lincoln almost a century ago. An honor guard will be on continuous duty during the night. On each side of the catafalque will be 2 lighted candles, and 2 priests on kneelers will pray for the president at his side throughout the night. The Kennedy family has asked that no flowers be sent either to the White House or to the funeral. They ask those who would otherwise have sent flowers to give to charity instead. Mrs. Kennedy stays with her husband's remains at Bethesda Naval Hospital so far, and she will remain there through the night. She is not under sedation. The Attorney General is with her. The whereabouts of their children is unannounced. And here, well, a long day has finally ended for Lyndon Johnson, and he has gone back, perhaps for the last time, to his home outside Washington. Tonight, no president or member of a presidential family occupies the White House. Outside this famous building, tonight like other nights lit by floodlights, a silent crowd of thousands has been walking for hours. It is not exactly a mourning crowd. One does not see many tears shed amongst them. It is, if a definition could be found of such a group, a history-conscious crowd, drawn, it seems, by the magnitude of the event. Across Pennsylvania Avenue, there are knots of more somber-looking people. There, police permit them to stand, while if they approach the White House, they're made to move on. Just what it is these thousands are hoping to see cannot be stated by any of them. The main White House activity is centered in the press section, where President Kennedy's staff works on into the night. Andrew Hatcher, who had been deputy to Presidential News Secretary Pierre Salinger, is in charge until his boss returns early tomorrow morning from a trip in which Secretary of State Rusk and he had planned to go to Japan. Also, Malcolm Kilduff, another Salinger assistant, is here. Kilduff was on the Dallas trip today. The strain is not difficult to perceive on either his or Hatcher's face, but there is work to do, and they are doing it. They are assisted by half a dozen secretaries who, in front of us, have held back their tears. This will be a long night for them, but not as long as the day has been. For a few more hours, they will work as the Kennedy team. This is Stephen Banker at the White House.
A brief and eloquent commentary on the events of the day and its significance was made by President Johnson himself, who, upon arriving at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, in the plane Air Force One bearing Mrs. Kennedy and the body of the late president, said simply, "This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask your help and God's." Then Mr. Johnson drove off to the executive offices of the president to assume the arduous and onerous burdens of the chief executive of the United States.
Dick, I don't believe that anybody who watched the new president in that brief appearance before the microphones at Andrews could have failed to have been impressed by his sense of determination and his seriousness at perhaps the most solemn moment of his life.
Yeah. And he matched the seriousness of the occasion by his will to get right down to work, because the presidency of the United States is not an honorific. It is not a position to be enjoyed. It is a mandate to do probably the hardest and most responsible work in the world.